Ena mana, ina reo, ina hautawha, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all on behalf of the team at the Building and Construction Industry Training Organisation. Ngā mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. Got to figure out how to make this thing go backwards and forwards.
That goes to your next slide.
Okay, cool.
That one goes back if you need to go back, so you're on the one page now.
I have to say that I'm always a bit daunted when I get asked to speak at these sorts of occasions, partly because of the almost total absence of te reo, but also as the only Māori chief executive of an industry training organisation, and possibly the only one in our history. I always feel a bit daunted about representing the whole sector. Also, 10 years in this role and about to retire, I'm also very aware of how little we've managed to achieve in the time that we've all been at this for the last 40 years. So I've started off with a slide that I used at the 2013 event, and just basically talking about how many Māori begin and end their whole tertiary experience in industry training. I gave the Tertiary Education Commission a ring this morning, and they tell me that that is 22,815 people right now. So a significant number of our people, this is tertiary education for them. And little is known or researched about those people or about learning in the workplace, and little attention is given. In fact, we operate inside an educational construct and a set of policy settings that are not designed for learning in the workplace. Most research that we see and that we try to take and apply in our learning environment is designed for an institutional tertiary sector, and so very difficult for us to apply. And although there are really well-known concepts and practices, they do not often apply to us. So just as one example, we know that operating as whānau and bringing people together is an effective and useful way to enhance their tertiary learning experience. But the reality of our world is that most of the enterprises that we deal with are 10 people or fewer, and in fact 90% of them are 5 people in a team. So our Māori apprentice is more often than not alone, and more often than not at a different building site every different day. So the concepts of being able to bring them together are very difficult for us to achieve. However, as a tertiary sector, we are all making gains. So this is the data that's come out recently around Māori from the 2013 census, and it's all good news. So the number of people with no qualification who are Māori have dropped in terms of the census, and in terms of level 1, all the others, we've got gains. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to cynically take all these numbers and test them against the overall growth in population to see if that moderates the joy that we might feel by this, but it's still good news. So, between us, we are making gains. So, 56.4% up in terms of bachelor degree or higher. That's a great achievement in that period between 2006 and 2013. And the same in the world of industry training. So, level 1 to 4, significant gains. And probably more importantly, in some senses, which I'll come back to later on, in terms of those people who are operating at the diploma level, smaller numbers, but still significant gains. So there are things that we can feel that we're making some ground. And the overall data is also looking positive. So this particular slide is clipped out of a report from the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment. I think you need a degree to actually say that title, but MB, Māori in the labour market. And the joy of this slide is all those upward arrows: participation, employment, labour market outcomes, all really, really positive. And the ones that are going down are the ones that we want to go down: unemployment and the NEET rate, the people who are not in education and training, all going down. But unfortunately, if we look at that over a time series using the census data, the picture is not quite so good. So the percentages overall of some of these have dropped. Now, once again, haven't tested this against population gain. So we're all, I think, in an environment where we're in constant headwind. But although we're in constant headwind, I think we still have to be confident about continuing the journey that we're all on. And unfortunately, we have a similar picture with those persistent social measures. So looking at Māori in poor households, once again, and unemployment, all relatively negative. So I've ended up taking a very economic approach to this presentation rather than an educational one, which is possibly an odd thing to do in an educational environment, but I will come to why I'm doing this. So this one's a bit hard to read. The two things are the same, so I've clipped the top level out of the bigger one, but this is looking at the jobs, basically, the distribution of Māori employers and the wages and jobs they get. So the good news is where you have a dark line, which is bigger than the light line, because the dark line is wages and the light line is jobs. So where you've got the dark line and that's bigger, it means that we've got a lot of Māori people in jobs where they're being well paid. But unfortunately, as you go down, those lines switch over. So the people that are represented in this room, for example, education and training is the most successful occupational sector for Māori in the New Zealand economy, because it's one of the few sectors where Māori are being well remunerated, being well remunerated for the efforts that they make. Only in the South Island for 3 hours and I've got a cold already. And we get similar pictures when we actually break that into occupational groups. So this particular one from the census is looking at Māori, male, female, and their total participation in roles. And if you have a look down there, we still are overly represented in the labourers. So almost 20% of our population that are employed are still low-wage economy and probably trapped in the low-wage economy. And this sort of reinforces it again. So this is the number of people that the change from 2013 from 2006. And once again, some really good news there, because if you have a look at the upper ones, 100,000 and over, 70,000 to 100,000, Māori have made significant gains. But proportionally, down, as you drop down, you'll see that the light green line creeps inexorably past the dark green line. And if you take into account the fact that you might debate the worth of the living wage as a measure, but the living wage is in that area of 30,000 to 40,000, and pretty well the majority of Māori in the workforce are below that line. Now, I'm not setting out to depress you, but take a different cut at this altogether. We're here in the rohi of Ngāi Tahu, where many Māori are in business, and this, I think, is quite a significant indicator. There's almost 22,000 Māori who have indicated that they're running their own businesses. And really the important thing about this is that although we are underrepresented in this area, the reality is that the median income gaps between people that run their own businesses and people that are employed is significantly better for Māori. So one of the things is in the industry training sector, what we're really interested in doing is not only helping people to get a trade, but get a career. And in many cases, there's a relatively high representation of Māori self-employed or business people who are actually in the trades. Now, I'll be the first to admit that education is not just about vocational education and training. I mean, I started off as a classical studies and art history graduate. Absolutely the best qualification you can gain to make sure that you're employed. And in fact, I probably should apologise to Julian, because it wasn't even from Auckland University. I'm a Massey graduate, so apologies to Julian if he's lurking around out the back there. So education is definitely more than employment. Although if you think about it, the majority of tertiary education is vocational. If it wasn't vocational, what are most of those people doing taking medical degrees, taking accounting, law degrees, veterinary science? I ran a very scientific poll last weekend. I talked to my 21-year-old granddaughter and her 7 flatmates, who are second-year Massey students, and said, "Why are you studying?" And they all said that they were studying to get a good job and to make sure that they had a viable income stream. Now, the sample doesn't apply to everybody, but I would actually argue with you that industry training organisation sees itself clearly as vocational education and training, but most of the tertiary system is indeed about vocational education and training. And, you know, classical studies, art history grad, I would argue that pure education is a societal good. So people that can reflect on the Greek crisis at the moment from an understanding and knowledge of Greek history and culture, there's something worthwhile in that inherently. And the same thing where we have many of our people undertaking programs which are about strengthening themselves in tikanga and te reo, they're all great things. But when you think about what we need to achieve as a people in terms of our health and well-being, the only pathway to our ultimate health and well-being is through the generation of household revenue. So you do have to ask whether it's enough, and I was really enchanted by the Monty Ohia question, what are you going to do? So all of these things are wonderful, but what are you going to do? Because at the BCITO we believe that what we're about is sustainable individuals and sustainable whānau by trying to make sure that they have an economic place in our society. And I think there's an urgency to this because we have a young population. So we have this very young population operating in what's increasingly a difficult economic environment. And we've just come out of a recession, and so in our industry, for example, thousands of people got laid off during the recession. The people that didn't get laid off were the people that were well trained, well educated, that the bosses actually needed for their businesses to be productive. And one of the puzzles that I've been struggling with that I'd love to solve before I retire, which is probably very unlikely, is why so many people trip over transition points. So the transition from secondary education, for example, into tertiary, or from any part of the education system into employment, people can constantly tripping up over those transition points. And it's a problem we haven't solved. And just to give you one example, in South Auckland, we're working in a partnership with the two large polytechnics and 4 other ITOs, and we're trying to put together a project that gets a centre of learning set up in the Auckland airport. And one of the things that's happening in South Auckland is that there are a large number of extremely worthy PTEs that when you go and visit them, they're full of our people, they're successfully learning, there's a hum and a palatable sense of achievement in that environment, but the products of those programs are only getting another certificate and they're going back on the couch. And yet the construction industry is an industry that is open to Māori and Pacifica participation, but somehow we're not preparing people that the bosses will hire. And it's a transition thing I'd love to change. So you've heard about Te Ako Tiki Tiki from an earlier presentation, and this is the core driver for us as an ITO around Māori and our engagement with Māori. Gareth Te Arago Kemp, just hiding down the back there, is our kai whakahaere who's been leading this endeavour. We talked about it last time I spoke in this particular venue. And our big drive in those last 2 years since I last spoke has been led by Gareth, which has been about this whole thing about creating leaders in our teams, people who had a personal commitment and the attitude and motivation to engage with Māori as Māori. We've been highly successful, I think, in that area, and we're reasonably proud of our achievements, but I'll talk to you a little about our failures in a moment. But one of our challenges right now is all that good work which we carried on mostly during the period of recession has now been overwhelmed by growth. So we've gone from 110 of us to 200 of us in a 2-year period, and all these new people are not part of that sort of cultural hothouse that we had operating. So we've a lot of work to do. So you know, you've heard about how that's been applied. This process has been applied by Hawkins, and we're pretty much in the same game. And we are feeling that we're continuing to make success. And certainly this is getting a lot of program attention. So, you know, right here in Christchurch, you've heard about He Toki Ki Te Rika, and you've heard about the additional learnings we're gaining that's going to reinforce all of our work from Ako Whakarururu Hou. And one of the things I will certainly acknowledge with what's been going on down here in Christchurch is the role that Ngāi Tahu have made by thinking their way through what you need to learn from the successes and failures of the past. And certainly we deal with every single Maori trade training program across the country, and the success here is all about personal mentoring and the wraparound service that's been put in place, and it's quite significantly different to what's happening anywhere else. Just going back to that transition point, one of the challenges for ITOs is that we're not allowed to deal with people unless they're in employment. So we are active in schools and those sorts of things, but we technically don't belong there because we're not supposed to deal with learners until they're actually in employment. That's our place, is the workplace. So one of the privileges that we have had over the last couple of years is to get funding from Te Puni Kōkiri, which allowed us to do that. So one of the real challenges that we face is that whenever we try to place Māori, because we run a job matching service in our national office, and one of our challenges in placing Māori into many of our workplaces is the bosses have a look at them and they're often short in some way in terms of the boss's vision of what an ideal employer will be. So the great thing about the Te Puni Kōkiri program was it gave us the opportunity to work with 95 cadets. Most of these people would not have ended up being employed because of deficiencies in the view of the typical bosses in the construction industry. And over a 6-month program, we took them all as individuals, tried to analyse what the individual elements were that we needed to add to that person to make them successful. And we were successful with 95 of those cadets, all in apprenticeships, all doing well, all now part of our cohort of learners. And once again, just recognising Gareth for the leadership he gave in that. The other piece of the puzzle, which we weren't quite as successful in, but we had 13 successes, was that we set out to work around this tuakana kaina concept. We believe that what we need to do with our Māori trainees is not help them get a job alone, not help them to get a trade alone, but to get a career in the construction industry. And we desperately need more models of people who have done that. People that are self-employed, people that are in supervision and management roles. And that's what we did in this program. So we managed to get 13 existing qualified technical tradespeople, get them trained in management and supervision, and start a new cohort of leaders and models. I might skip over that because you can't actually see it very well. But this is just sort of like a breakdown of Māori in our ITO. So, for example, we've got over 1,000 in carpentry alone. But importantly to note that the construction industry is a really big industry. There is actually room for everybody in the construction industry, regardless of what your talents or abilities are. So where are we on the BC ITO journey with this? We are constantly challenged by the constraints of the system. We're currently being challenged by growth. So that's a good challenge to have. It's certainly a better challenge than the challenge we faced during the recession. And particularly from us and our own personal perspective is our Maori completion rates are lagging. So we are, in terms of the EPIs, the Educational Performance Indicators, what we have to perform against our contracts with the TEC, we do well, theoretically. So our participation rate is high, but that is because we're in an industry that has a long tradition of Māori and Pacifica being an accepted and important part of the industry. But internally as an organisation, we're constantly challenged by our desire to make sure that Māori completion rates are the same as everybody else's, and we haven't achieved that. And our Māori strategy is currently undergoing a refresh because we think we're moving into a new era. But this is the tough news for the BC ITO. Now, I know that some of my fellow chief executives, not just in ITOs but in tertiary institutions generally, tell me that it's bad form to put your performance measures up on the screen and admit your failures. But this is what we're exercised by. So what this is just comparing the completion of Māori against all of our other trainees and apprentices. So if you have a look at credit completion, we do reasonably well. So we've got a 70% completion rate for Māori at levels 1 to 3, and I will tell you that we have very few learners at level 1 to 3, and they are our most difficult cohort, so many of them are in the correction system, for example, but there's a 9% gap there. So for us as an ITO, we're very exercised by this 9% gap and our desire to close that gap. For level 4 and above, we're doing slightly better, so we've got a 7% gap that we've exercised to close with Māori performance. Not so good with program completion, so these are people that get right to the end of their qualification and then graduate. So once again, our problem area is levels 1 to 3, and particularly those in the correction system. For example, one of our failures is they get discharged. Not a societal failure, I have to say, that's a good thing. But you know, we do have quite a lot of learners in our small cohort of levels 1 to 3 that don't complete, but a 24% gap in achievement is unacceptable in our view, and that's the charge we put against ourselves. Once again, not so bad with level 4 and above, because these are your classical apprentices that are graduating and coming out as technical tradesmen. 7% gap, but still a gap we'd like to close. I don't think that we, or any of us as tertiary organisations, should ever feel proud when there's a gap identifiable around the achievement of any group of learner. And I have to say that our figures are quite similar for Pacifica as well. And increasingly we are becoming, paying attention to new migrants with English as a second language as well. So, it's early days for us. So, you know, I used to work in China a lot, and whenever things went badly wrong, my Chinese colleagues used to always say, in the course of 1,000 years, it won't matter. I don't have 1,000 years, but maybe we do. So, early days in this journey of our own making. I've used the whakatauki a few times, but I decided this time around I'd acknowledge where I first stole it from, which was a presentation by Mātua Sir Mark Solomon. But this is what it is about. It is for us and for our children. Thank you.